Hey, so welcome back to my channel. This is going to be a recap of Haunting of Hill House, season 1, episode 4, the twin thing. So this is going to be all about Luke. So you see Luke as a little boy, and he's sitting in the yard with the little painting, with the little drawing or something, and he was talking to somebody about what had happened in the basement, I believe. And so when he said, "Do you believe me, Abigail?" And so we pan out, and then you see the little girl in the blue dress, who he said was the girl in the woods. And so we know her name is Abigail. And so we flash to him. I guess when he first got to rehab, he looked a hot mess. And so he's sitting in this group counseling session, and there was this guy who was talking about his battle. And he went into this long, kind of really sad story about how he lost his sight, and like what precipitated, I guess, his addiction. He was in the military, and he was in Iraq, I believe he said, and they had bombed a school or something, and they went in, and he said he saw this little girl. And he starts describing what she looked like and what happened to her eyes, and saying what happens to fire, what fire does to eyes, and this whole thing. And it looked like runny eggs on dark skin, and so on black skin, and it's just that imagery he could just never get out of his head. He could constantly see this little girl, and he didn't say that he used the knitting needles to blind himself, but it was insinuated that when he kept saying that he kept seeing the girl. And one day, I guess he was high, and he grabbed the knitting needles, and he's blind now. And he was saying that he can still see her. And he, I forget, was it 90 days? I forget how long he'd been clean. But he was saying that was the longest he'd ever been clean. And then, the counselor asked if any of the newbies wanted to share. And of course, obviously nobody did. And so you fast forward 90 days later, Luke, he looks a lot healthier, and he's getting his 90-day chip. And you go up and they hand you the chip, and then he was about to start a story, and then there's a flashback of him as a little boy back in the house, and he was telling his father about what happened in the basement. And of course his father is trying to reassure him, nothing, wasn't happening, it was just a bad dream, I used to have imaginary friends too. And of course Luke is like, no, I know what I saw, I know what happened. And the mom comes down with a box of old stuff. I guess they're doing this renovation, they're finding all kinds of stuff in this house. And so Nellie is there. She's hiding somewhere, so she could see her hiding. And so she started talking about this button. I guess Nellie had a thing for buttons, and so she found this old can that had a lot of different buttons in it. And so of course Nellie came out. She was all excited and happy. And Luke saw this hat in the box, and he asked if he could have the hat. And so his father's like, I don't know. This looks like it's for a big boy, and you look like a big boy to me. And so he was basically saying that basically, if you, admit that, or if you understand that what you saw wasn't really what you saw and whatever, then you could have this hat. But he couched it like, you're a big boy now, and you got this big boy hat, and we don't get big boys, don't be afraid, and the whole thing. So he gave him the hat and put it on him, and he was adorable. And so and I think the mom asked, do you like the hat? And Nellie said, yeah, of course he likes the hat. And the dad was like, well, how do you know? And she was like, well, it's a twin thing. So up until this point, I didn't know that Nellie and Luke were twins. Go figure. But they are. So they run off to play. And the mom found the shawl in the box, and she wrapped it around her. And he started asking her, like, what she saw. She made this very vivid imagery of how the room would be designed, and where the parents would be sitting, and where the children would be sitting. And she mentioned the child in the wheelchair. There's going to be a bookshelf that even a child in the wheelchair can reach. And he was like, that was very specific. And then she looked up, and I don't know, it was like some ropes and stuff that was hanging. She was like, that's dangerous. And she was basically asking if you can clear it up. Like, that's an accident waiting to happen. So I'm like, oh, what's going to happen? So, yeah, they're finally getting into, I guess, the person that is Luke. So we flash back to Luke, and he's back in his room now with a lady named Joey. And he was saying something about the fourth step. And I don't know if the fourth step is where he has to list. I don't know if you have to like list all of the wrongs, all the people you've wronged or something. He was like, it's extremely difficult for him to do that because and then he started running down the list of his siblings of how he screwed them over basically. And he noticed something. Joey, she I guess is not herself. He could tell something's bothering her. And around this time, the counselor calls, for lights out. So now it's time for everybody to go to bed, go back to their rooms, whatever the case. And so it looks like she was about to tell him what the problem was, but she didn't get a chance. So people started, he shares a room with, I thought that he was in prison, but he's actually in rehab. And so he shares a room with like 4 or 5 other people. So she went back to her room. They said their good nights. And as she was walking out, the counselor was telling him that, oh, your brother called, but I told him that you weren't in. He was like, oh, okay. He said, so maybe you should call them tomorrow and tell them about your 90-day chip. He's like, they're not going to believe me. Like, he just, excuse me. He's burned them so much. Like, he just feels like at this point, there's really not a whole lot he could do to redeem himself. And so she's basically trying to encourage him to, to call them. So they get out, they're all in bed. And this is where you have the scene where in the first episode where they all woke up around the same time, it was like 3 minutes after the hour. So it was like 12:03 where he is, because him and Steven live in the same city. And when he woke up, he grabbed his throat, he grabbed his neck. So I don't know if something happened, like because her mom was mentioning the cords, somebody's gonna hang themselves or whatever, but he jumped up grabbing his neck. And then he saw Nellie. He opened his eyes and saw Nellie. She was standing over by the window, and she just whispered to him saying, go. And then he flashed back to when him and Nellie was children back in the house, and they were playing with that system that looked like horns. Not horn. Well, I'm gonna say like almost like trumpets or something, where they were talking. They're able to talk to the people upstairs and downstairs. And so Nellie is in the room, upstairs in the room, and Luke is in the kitchen. And so she's throwing buttons down to see if they're going to go all the way down. And so she was like, I threw 3. Did you get 3? And he was like, I only got 2. And so she's like, I threw 3. And he was like, well, maybe one got stuck. And so she came down, and he was like, well, what are we going to do? And so they was, coming up, little kids. Oh, maybe we can get some rocks and throw it down there, and it'll dislodge it, and it'll come out. So next thing you know, the horn spits the button out. And so they look at it, and then you hear this raspy voice of this elderly lady calling for Clara. So they're standing there. Of course, because they're like, so she said that, you're scared. She's like, you're scared. This was Nellie talking to Luke. He said, well, why? He said, well, why do you say that? She's like, because I'm scared too. And so he went back upstairs because he was like, oh, that was just either mom or, I don't even say, or if he said it was either Shirley or Theo playing a prank on him or something. So he went back up to the room. And so he yells downstairs, and Nell's like, I told you no one is here. And so next thing you see a reflection of the old lady, and the voice is a lot louder, calling for whoever this Clara person is. I don't know if she was the caretaker of this woman. And he hauls ass and runs downstairs, and just as he jumps off the stairs, you see Luke as an adult jumping off his bunk, about to get his day started. So, at this point, I'm assuming he's going to call Steve, and that's when he's going to find out that Nellie's dead. If he didn't already come to that conclusion after seeing her as a ghost in front of him, and Steve, whatever that was, I'm thinking that's what's about to happen. Okay, so Luke gets up the next morning, and he finds a note under his bed, and so he goes to the group counseling and find out that Joey left. And so they started talking about, that's why, you know, and this is the counselor talking to the group, like, that's why they don't allow you to get into personal relationships or form attachments to people, because eventually their fear is that your attachment to a person, especially while you're in rehab, can do more harm than good. And so, because of all the emotional things that go along with how relationships are, ups and downs or whatever. So he was like, well, we're not in a relationship, we're just friends. And so he got up and he left and he went back to the room. You could see that it looked like he was having some sort of attack, like, oh my God, is he going to go out and use? So the counselor went to the room to talk to him. Steve was gone. Luke was gone. And so he went to where he knows that Joey, I guess she hangs out at this park, and he actually calls Nellie and left a message for her, telling her that he had the weirdest dream, or, you know, had that whole vision about him and about her, and he's trying to, you know, just wanted to make sure that she was okay. And so he sat in the park for a while, and he kind of watched the deals go down, and it's like, oh man, is he about to break? And, you know, this dog started barking really loud, so it kind of scared him. It kind of snapped him back to reality. And then you flash back to when he was a kid, and remember the kids were talking about their dogs on the property. They hear them at night. So he wakes up and looks over, and Nellie's fast asleep. And the next thing you know, he hears a noise, like something is banging, like hitting the floor or something. So he gets up and walks out, sticks his little head out the room, and he sees a cane. And you know how somebody walks with a cane, but the person, their feet wasn't touching the ground. There was like a man who was floating, but had the cane. So it was the cane that was making the noise. And so, of course, that scared him half to death. So he went back into the room, closed the door, and he hid under the bed. And so, next thing you know, you see the door open, and the entity floats in with this cane, and the whole time he's holding his breath. He's trying to be as quiet as he can. And the entity came in and kind of looked around. I guess you can see he was like taking survey of the room. He didn't hear anything. He didn't see anything. And so he was about to walk to the door. And poor Luke, he couldn't hold his breath anymore. So he started breathing, you know, really loud, like trying to gasping for air. And so the entity turned around and eventually got to the bed and kind of kneeled down and looked under the bed. And you heard him scream so freaking loud. And it flashed back to him. He's still out looking for Zoe. And so you see this car, you hear a car horn and almost hit somebody. And then he sees Joey. I keep trying to call that woman Joey. And he finds her and he wants to take her back to the rehab center. But he calls the rehab center and the counselor's like, you know the deal. If you leave, you lose your spot. So she lost her spot when she left. And then damn, he lost his spot because he left to go get her. And so he tried to beg the lady, and the counselor was like, I'm sorry, you know, we're all full up. You basically, you leave, you lose. And so now he's trying to figure out where they're going to stay tonight. And so he goes to Steve's house. And Leah, Steve's wife, opens the door. And he finds out that Leah and Steve are separated, and he doesn't live there anymore. And so now he's, you know, trying to ask her for money. He's really trying to drive home the fact that he's been clean for 90 days and that, you know, he needs a place to stay, or if she can give him some money. And she's like, you know what, I'm really proud of you. I really am, but we've been through this. You know, you can't stay here. And while she's talking, you can see that he's having a flashback. But the flashback wasn't him as a kid. It was a flashback of him in that house with Joey. He had taken her to their house for dinner. And so they're talking, and Steve is kind of being kind of short with him. And, you try to understand the plight of an addict, but at the same time, if you've been burned a number of times by somebody you love, you kind of don't have the same sympathy and patience. So they're talking, and, you know, Steve was being kind of short and kind of condescending to them. And so, after dinner, Steve and Luke are in the kitchen getting dessert together, and he was basically like, he's trying to, I guess Steve was trying to figure out the nature of their relationship, and Luke is just like, we're just friends, and that, she stayed with me when I went through withdrawals, and he's like, have you ever been through, do you know what that's like? And of course he was like, no, and he's like, no, it's hell, and it's describing all the symptoms, and he was like, yeah, okay. And so he's listening to him, but he's just like, I think he's just over it. Like, he's heard the same story over and over again. And he was like, yeah, he was like, he was, talking about, just Steve talking about Joey. And like, I think that she's charismatic and I think slick. And, of course, Luke took offense to that because he's like, he feels like she's a really nice person and she's been there and she understands. Because what he's been through and what he's going through, because she's been through it and she's going through it too. And so at the end of that conversation, he leaves angry. And so that's when you hear Steve's door open in present time. And so we're catching up now where Luke breaks into Steve's apartment. And in the first episode when Steve gets home and he's checking his mailbox and he sees Luke coming down the stairs. And he that's where we are now in the story. So we already know how that plays out. Like, he basically told him he could take the camera. It was an old camera, but he had to leave the tablet and whatever it could be. But in the end, Luke was like, it's not what you think. He ended up giving him the camera and a tablet back, and I think Steve ends up giving him everything he had, which is probably like $100, $200, something like that. Okay, so he meets up with Joey after getting the $200, and you can tell that Joey, all she can think about right now is getting high. And so they're walking. He's talking about getting a hotel and getting them some food. And she's like, I just need to go over here and pee or whatever. So she leaves in to kiss him. And you can tell she pickpocketed him, right? I just assumed when she did that, that's what she did. So she ended up taking the money. And she's God knows where. So him in rehab was like months earlier, where he stands up when he got his 90-day thing. Or maybe a few days earlier. So in real time now, this is where he's now basically out on the street. So he's walking. First he was standing in some alley where homeless people go to stay warm because they had those barrels with the fire and all that. And then he's walking. Some junkies jumped him, beat the shit out of him, took his shoes and his coat. It's the dead of winter, so now he's walking around freezing. He's back in the park where these drug deals are going down. And for some reason he keeps counting. And so it's actually flashing back and forth. So it's flashing back to when he's telling he's giving his whole speech, I guess, after getting the 90-day chip. And then it's showing where he is now. So you can hear like the voiceover of him giving the speech with what's going on now. So he's back in the park. And when he was in the park with Zoe before he went to Steve's old house, he saw the man in the hat. And so he's back in the park now. He's walking around shivering because he's walking around in t-shirts and no shoes. And he's counting like from 1 to 7. He keeps counting from 1 to 7, taking steps. And then he sees the man in the hat again in the park. But he can only see the back of the man. And then he ends up calling the rehab center, begging to come back. He's like telling them like, I lost her. I couldn't help her. I couldn't save her. I'm freezing. I don't have a coat or shoes or anything. I don't give a damn if I have to sleep on the floor. Can I come back? And that's when the lady was like, we're going to come and get you. And you saw Steve sitting across from him. So Steve actually went to the rehab to tell him about Nell. And so while he's waiting, it seemed like it took them a long time to get there. So while he's waiting, he's steadily walking back and forth, counting. And it's like, why is he counting? And then you flash back to when he was a kid. And then him and Nell, they're back in the house, and Nell is up. So she's seen the bent neck lady again, and she's now sitting in her bed, sitting in her bed. So he wakes up and asks her what was wrong, and she told her what was going on. And the counting comes from when, I guess to put her at ease, like this circle of protection or something. He takes the can of buttons that their mom gave her, and he laid out 7, and it was 1 represented each one of them. And he said, all you have to do, if you get scared, just count from 1 to 7. And sometimes you have to do it more than once. And so that's where that counting was coming from. So it's dark. He's walking back and forth, counting from 1 to 7. Then he turns around and he sees the man, the old man with the cane. still just the back of his head. And so he was walking and he's counting and he stops. And then you see the entity gliding behind him and he stops. And he walks again and he stops. And then he eventually, you see a tear fall from his eye and he turns around and he sees his mother. And I don't know if she says come home or something, she said. And you saw these lights come from her eyes. And of course, when he covered his eyes, and when he uncovered his eyes, it was the counselor and Steve pulling up in the car. And so he runs up to Steve and he was like, I'm so sorry, I couldn't save her. And I think initially he thought he was talking about Nell, but he was talking about Joey. And he was like, Steve was telling him, you got to come with him. You got to come with me. And so, of course, Luke is like, why? What's going on? Why? And he had to tell him, it's Nell, she died. She's dead. And he was, of course, in shock. And he said, well, how did it happen? He was like, Steve said, suicide. And he kept rubbing his neck. So I don't know if they're insinuating that she hung herself or somehow in that house, some entity things conspired that she ended up being hanged. But he kept rubbing his neck, and he started rubbing his neck because he was looking at him, and he was like, and Luke said, no, it wasn't. Like, she didn't commit suicide. And that's how the episode ends. So it's like, oh my God, poor Luke. I know they all experienced something, but it seemed like Luke got it the worst. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so that's how this episode ended. And, I'm going to end this here, and I will talk to you guys in the next episode.